Good morning, everybody. It looks like we still have a few more people logging in. So while we wait, if you'll go ahead and we'll do a quick sound quality check. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, that way we can check to make sure you can hear me okay and that you can see the screen okay. Perfect. Lots of raised hands. Thanks so much. All right, we'll give it just another minute while a few more people get logged in.
And Emily, I'm seeing a lot of raised hands. This is Lori. I'm wondering if people could let me know if they can hear Lori now speaking by raising your hand. Excellent. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. So first off, good morning. Welcome to the Continuing Approval Review webinar. During this webinar, you will not be able to converse with other attendees or presenters. However, you are encouraged to ask questions. To ask questions, please do so by typing into the question bar. Presenters will pause periodically to answer as many questions as possible. All questions will be answered either during the webinar or as a follow-up to the webinar, depending on time. Let's get started. Once again, good morning. You are in attendance this morning because you have been notified that your Educator preparation program is scheduled for a continuing approval review. The purpose of this webinar is to provide guidance on how to prepare for the review and to provide an overview of what to expect during and after the review. We know that there may be others listening into the webinar today that are not scheduled to be reviewed for the 2020-2021 year and would ask that anyone with a question that is not being reviewed this year, please save your questions for the end of the webinar if there is remaining time available. We want to address the most immediate concerns that the programs being reviewed may have during our time today. Remember, you can always reach out to your assigned program specialist with any question you have about the review process. Please note that hereafter in this webinar, I will refer to an Educator preparation program as an EPP. The EPP is the entity that houses all of the different certification programs, such as the undergraduate teacher program, the post-bac principal program, the university-based alternative superintendent certification program, and the like. There are 28 EPPs on the schedule for review this year. There are a variety of staff from those EPPs present on this webinar today. This webinar will be posted on the Program Provider Resources page for those EPPs who could not attend today or for those who want to revisit the training at any point. TEA staff attending include your program specialist, Vanessa Alba, Lori Ayers, Emily Newton, and Angela Von Hatten, and directors Mark Olofsson and Tam Jones. I am Emily Newton, and I'll be your presenter today. We also look forward to hearing from Lori Ayers later in the presentation. In your notification letter, you were assigned one of the program specialists who will facilitate your review. Please note that the program specialist assigned to facilitate your review may not be your usual assigned program specialist. This decision was made for an even distribution of workload for efficiency in completing reviews. You will also notice that there are two new program specialists, myself and Angela. We are both fully up to speed on reviews and TAC and have completed a year of reviews already, so we're already seasoned veterans at this point. Please note that hereafter in this webinar, when I refer to you, I am referring to your EPP since you are here as the representative of your EPP. For the purpose of this webinar, we have broken the review process into 4 parts. We will first go over preparing for the review. We will also cover what happens during the review, followed by next steps, and finally, we will talk about the continuing approval part of the continuing approval review. The legal authority of each program scheduled for review in 2020-2021 should have received a notification email that contained important attachments. Those attachments would have included a notification letter with important dates, a handbook, a status report, and a scope and sequence document. We will refer to those documents during this webinar, so you may find it helpful to keep them handy. Let's first take a look at the steps taken to prepare for a desk review, an on-site review, or a virtual on-site review. The continuing approval review is required in the Texas Administrative Code. Please note, for the remainder of this webinar, I will refer to the Texas Administrative Code as TAC, and Educator Preparation Programs will be referred to as EPPs. As a condition of continuing approval as an EPP, 19 TAC Chapter 228.10b requires TEA to review each EPP every 5 years. A review may also be conducted outside of the 5-year cycle at the discretion of TEA or for the purposes of a pre-approval or post-approval of a new EPP. During the review, the documents and records review process is focused on the alignment of EPP policies and processes with requirements in TAC. Based on the outcome of the review, together with accreditation status, the EPP is either approved by the approved by the State Board of Educator Certification, also referred to as SBEC, to continue certifying educators. TAC requires TEA to conduct reviews of EPPs, and it also requires that EPPs retain and provide documentation of the candidate's completion of the admission and certification requirements. The purpose and goal for the review process and for determining annual accreditation status is to promote high-quality EPPs that produce effective educators. The review process should be looked upon as a foundation for continuous improvement for those who want to improve. TEA continues to collect feedback from EPPs regarding the review process, and we are committed to the continuous improvement of the review process. In the Continuing Approval Review Handbook that was attached to your notification letter, and in this webinar, you will find information about different types of reviews. The term Continuing Approval Review is used in relation to the 5-year review and the discretionary review. The outcomes of either type of review factor into the continuing approval of the EPP. Whether TEA staff conducts a 5-year continuing approval review or discretionary continuing approval review, the review will be in one of 3 formats, either a desk format, an on-site format, or a new virtual on-site format. The desk review requires the EPP to send documents for review to TEA. The on-site review requires TEA staff to conduct the review on-site at the EPP, and in the event that TEA staff is unable to travel due to COVID-19 for an on-site review, TEA staff will complete a virtual on-site review. The virtual on-site review requires the EPP to send documents for review to TEA, but will be conducted following an on-site format using synchronous digital platforms. The format of the continuing approval review is determined by the outcome of the risk assessment, which we will talk about a little bit more later. In general, those EPPs identified with the highest risk are reviewed in the on-site format. It is important to note here, TAC requires an on-site review format for both pre-approval and post-approval reviews of new EPPs. Regardless of the type or format of the review, all EPPs are held to the same standard of quality and accountability during the review. Please note, going forward in this webinar, there will be information that is relevant only to those programs receiving desk reviews and other information that is relevant to those receiving on-site or virtual on-site reviews. I will do my best to be clear when going over that information to avoid confusion. Now let's take a look at an overview of the review process. First, TEA identifies which EPPs are up for a 5-year continuing approval review, a discretionary review, or are a new EPP ready for a pre or post-approval review. Second, each identified EPP is evaluated using the risk assessment. Third, each identified EPP is notified by TEA of the upcoming 5-year continuing approval review and receives training to help the EPP prepare for the upcoming review. We are currently on this step in the timeline. Fourth, TEA works with the EPPs during their scheduled time to complete the on-site, virtual on-site, or desk review. And last, TEA recommends the EPPs to SBEC for continuing approval. You can see this process that regardless of the format of your review, the process is the same. The primary difference between the desk review, the on-site review, and the virtual on-site review, other than the location, is the depth of the review. For EPPs at highest risk, a deeper review is conducted to try to uncover and find solutions for root cause issues that may be adversely affecting the functionality of the EPP and the preparation of its candidates. Ultimately, all EPPs being reviewed during a reporting year will be approved or not by the SBEC for continuation. Let's take a step back a minute and talk about the risk assessment. 19 TAC 228.10b3 requires TEA staff to use a risk assessment to determine the need for discretionary reviews and the type of 5-year reviews. This rule also identifies the factors that must be included in the risk assessment. There is a detailed description of the risk assessment and the related calculations in the handbook attached to your notification email, so I'll just give a high-level overview here. On this graphic, the 2 boxes in blue entitled Accreditation Data and Annual Performance Data represent the data that must be used to calculate the base number. From that base number, a sliding scale was used to factor in the impact of the 3 areas identified in the red boxes, entitled Accreditation Status, Accreditation by Other Organizations, and Formal Complaints. An EPP that had an accreditation status of accredited probation was automatically placed in the highest risk stage. After all of the data and information was tabulated, one number was generated for each EPP. Stage 1 EPPs were at highest risk, with Stage 3 EPPs at lowest risk. EPPs that were identified as highest risk are scheduled for an on-site review. For your reference, information about your risk stage was provided in the notification letter attached to your notification email. Now let's look at the notification letter attached to the notification email sent to your EPP legal authority. As I mentioned earlier, this letter contains some important information. First, the letter identifies the date of the review. For EPPs that will be completing a desk review or virtual on-site review, this is the date on which all documents and records to be reviewed are due at TEA, and will also be the official start date of your document review. This date is almost always on a Monday, unless a holiday requires the start date to be on a Tuesday. For EPPs that will be reviewed on-site, this should be the date TEA will be on-site to open the review. The start date of an on-site review is almost always a Tuesday, which allows for Monday to be a travel day for TEA staff. For all EPPs being reviewed, there is another date on the letter on which the status report is due at TEA. This will be 2 weeks prior to the start date of the review because the status report is used by TEA staff to prepare for the review. As mentioned earlier, the results of the risk assessment for your EPP is included in the letter, and also the contact information for the review program specialist assigned to guide you through your review. TAC 229.9 requires a fee for on-site reviews. The fee is $4,500. The payment must be made during the payment window anytime between September 1st and September 30th, 2020. When submitting the fee for an on-site or virtual on-site review, EPPs must complete and submit an Educator Preparation Program fee form. This form is available in Appendix A of the Continuing Approval Review Handbook. Once invoiced for the on-site or virtual on-site review, EPPs must submit their payment via check, money order, or electronically. Directions for electronic payment are available in Appendix B of the Continuing Approval Review Handbook. Please note, if submitting the fee electronically, you will need to contact your review program specialist to receive the appropriate routing information. This information was left out of the handbook for security purposes. Next, virtual on-site reviews will be treated with the attention and focus of on-site reviews and will require the same $4,500 fee as on-site reviews. Lastly, there is no fee identified in TAC for a desk review. A continuing approval review handbook was also attached to your notification email. TEA recommends that you read the handbook start to finish because it contains more detail than can be provided in this webinar. For example, I mentioned earlier that there is a detailed description of the risk assessment calculation in the handbook. An additional resource for you will be the review rubric. You will find that the rubric looks very much like Figure 19 TAC 228.10b1 that provides examples of evidence of compliance with TAC. The difference is that the review rubric is updated annually, while the figure may not reflect the most recent updates in TAC. The review rubric will be used to score compliance in your review. A copy of the rubric is found on the Program Providers Resources page on the TEA website. Please check the footer of the rubric document to make sure it reflects the 2020-2021 year. Do not use a rubric from any other year to prepare for this review, please. When you look at the review rubric, you'll notice it is divided into 9 components that are used to determine program approval. One thing to keep in mind is that the rubric contains the most updated versions of TAC, but the continuing approval review is a look back, so some of the current TAC may not have been in effect at the point in time reflected in some of the EPP records. EPPs are held accountable for following rules that were in effect at the time the candidate was admitted and/or processed, as identified in the implementation date for that rule. For example, admission records are reviewed for candidate Susie Smith. Susie's records do not contain a formal admission letter. Susie's admission date, as reflected on other documents, was September 1st, 2015, which was before the formal admission letter was required, starting with applicants admitted on or after March 1st, 2016. We have included the effective dates for all applicable rules in TAC in the review rubric. A blank copy of the status report was also attached to your notification email. This document is meant to be completed electronically because it contains spaces that expand to accommodate as much information as you want or need to provide. The status report is required in 19 TAC 228.10b1. In the spirit of best practice, the status report is not just busy work. TEA review teams use this document to learn important information about your programs, which provides context in which to review your documents and records. Some portion of the rubric may be scored from this document. Feedback from EPPs in combination with our ability to access more EPP data through our systems has helped TEA scale back the status report document so that the EPP can convey information to TEA in a way that is concise yet individualized for the EPP. If you have the status report document handy, take a look at it for a moment. The first pages are devoted to general EPP information, including contact information and general background information about the programs within the EPP. The document then has a section devoted to each of the 9 components where EPP's staff convey to TEA that they may meet or exceed TAC requirements. If you want TEA to know more about how you exceed requirements, there is space to report that as well. Remember to think about and include all of your programs in these responses. You may find some areas that ask for candidate information also, such as the sections that ask you to identify candidates placed in out-of-state clinical teaching, internship, or practicum assignments. Because they contain candidate identifiers, Responses in these areas will require you to submit the status report to TEA via secure submission, which we will go over later on. Finally, there are attachments that we want you to submit with the completed status report. These are noted in the appendix section at the end of the document. EPPs with a risk stage of 1 or 2 will need to complete the scope and sequence document and return it to TEA as an appendix item with the status report. This document is also meant to be completed electronically. To complete this document, program staff should evaluate all programs within the EPP and identify the certificate area that includes the addition of the Science of Teaching Reading, also known as STR standards. You will then populate the chart with all of the courses taken by the candidate in this certificate area. This screenshot depicts the first section of the scope and sequence document, which is courses taken prior to clinical teaching, internship, or practicum. There are 2 other sections, courses taken during and courses taken after clinical teaching, internship, or practicum. The scope and sequence document will be used with the curriculum evaluation portion of the review. With the upcoming changes to certificate areas that include the addition of the Science of Teaching Reading standards, those certificate areas will be the focus of the curriculum review for the 2020-2021 continuing approval review. Component 3 of the status report has been updated to reflect this focus. All EPPs being reviewed that are approved to offer a certificate area that includes the STR standards will be asked to select their highest volume certificate area and provide a performance-based assessment with its related rubric from that area. EPPs will also be asked to complete and submit the appropriate alignment charts for their highest volume certificate area. For all EPPs being reviewed in the 2020-2021 year, the status report is due 2 weeks prior to the start date of the review that is identified on the notification letter. As previously mentioned, for your convenience, there is also a status report due date included in the letter. You are encouraged to submit the status report and appendix items via the share file from your review program specialist or using the TEA help desk system, which can be accessed from the homepage on the TEA website. We will cover document submission again in more detail later on. It is important that all of your documents are carefully labeled so that TEA review program specialists understand the documents they are reviewing. This is also true of the appendix items submitted with the status report. Please use the appendix letter in the file or document name. Before we move on to part 2, we are going to pass the mic over to Lori Ayers, who will help us answer a couple questions. Just a reminder, please let us hear questions from the programs being reviewed this year first. And if we do not have time to get to all the questions today, we will follow up with the responses to all your questions in an FAQ after the webinar.
Okay, Emily, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Lori.
Okay, good. So we don't have very many questions at this point. One question was, will this presentation be shared? And yes, the presentation is being recorded and it will be posted. Give us a couple of days to get the recording processed and then we'll get it posted. There's also a question on here from a specific program that's unique to that program that's not going to be offering the certificates that use STR, that require STR. And so we will, your review, assigned review program specialist will get with you on that and give you an alternative that you will submit for your curriculum review. So we will get back with you specifically on that. The status report, this question says, is the status report only for high-risk programs? No, the status report is for all programs who are being reviewed completing and submitting a status report is a requirement in TAC for programs that are being reviewed. Okay, so to save time, let's go back to you, Emily, and we'll continue to pause for questions. And then at the end, I'll try to cover some more questions. And then as Emily said earlier, we will post the remaining questions that we did not get to answer as FAQs. Back to you, Emily.
All right, thanks, Lori. Okay, now let's move on to part 2 and talk a bit about how to prepare and submit the records and documents for review. And we'll talk a little bit about the review itself. First, please keep in mind that TEA does not expect or want you to create documents just because they are requested for a review. The review process is about reviewing the EPP as it exists. For example, TEA may ask to see the handbook you provide to your mentor teachers. TAC does not require the EPP to provide a handbook to mentor teachers. So if you do not usually provide a handbook to mentor teachers, TEA does not expect or want you to create one just for the review. Conversely, TAC does require that the EPP provide training to their mentor teachers. So if TEA asks to see evidence of that training, it would be expected that you as the EPP are able to provide that documentation. Before we move on to the next slide, let's go over some training logistics. It is at this point in the webinar, training gets a little tricky. If you recall at the beginning of this webinar, we looked at an overview of the review process and identified that the review process is the same until you get to the actual review. And then there are some subtle differences in the way the desk review, the on-site review, and the virtual on-site review are conducted. In an effort to minimize confusion, as we go over the requirements on the remaining slides, I will identify for you whether I'm talking about a desk review, an on-site review, or a virtual on-site review. So putting my classroom teacher hat back on for a moment, I need to encourage you to please pay close attention so you don't miss anything. Please note that the top of the slide indicates this information is for programs receiving a desk review. So those of you in attendance that are receiving desk reviews, you'll want to pay particular attention to this slide. Desk review folks, your continuing approval review will address all 9 components in TAC. Components 1, governance, 3, curriculum, and 7, the complaints process, will be reviewed using records available in-house at TEA and using information provided by the EPP on the status report document. It is important that you keep this in mind as you are completing the status report so that TEA is provided complete information in these areas. If the review process uncovers issues related to any of these 3 areas, TEA staff may request additional documentation from you. For example, if it is discovered that you have a low pass rate on a certification exam for one certificate area, then TEA may request additional documentation, such as samples of the assessments used in the coursework for the certificate area. In addition, if the desk review process uncovers significant issues in multiple areas, a site visit may be required. In the event a site visit is required, there will be a fee of $4,500 for that visit. In Appendix D of the handbook, you will find a document called Continuing Approval, Desk Review, Document and Records Submission Instructions, 2020-2021. This document contains a list of records and other documentation that must be submitted to TEA for review. All of these records and documents must be received at TEA on or before the start date of your review identified in your notification letter. You will note that this document also provides guidance on how to label documents and files for submission. Please make sure file names are not long because long file names are difficult to download at TEA. Now let's discuss some on-site review information. If you're receiving a review in the on-site format, this slide is for you. Please note here that the only documents and records you submit to TEA will be the status report and related attachments. Those are due 2 weeks prior to the start date identified on your notification letter. When you read through the notification letter, you will note the due date for the status report has been identified for you. All other documents and candidate records will be reviewed by TEA at your EPP site. All 9 components will be reviewed in depth. For example, the certificate area identified in the scope and sequence document will be a certificate area including the addition of STR standards. The TEA review team will ask to look at some curriculum items such as performance assessments and alignment charts, and may request to interview some faculty delivering instruction in this area. In another example, if your EPP is rated accredited probation due to quality of field supervision, we may visit with your field supervisor or other EPP staff about your process for communicating requirements regarding field supervision. Because the on-site review involves gathering information from faculty and staff, as well as from EPP records, it will be important for the program legal authority to make sure those staff are available during that time. Likewise, if your records are stored electronically, EPP staff will need to work with TEA reviewers to access those records. TEA will not access the EPP database. The assigned review program specialist will provide an agenda for the review so that the EPP staff can plan their participation ahead of time. In the event TEA staff are unable to travel due to COVID-19, on-site reviews will be conducted virtually. So everyone needs to pay close attention to this, especially our on-site review folks. During a virtual on-site review, EPPs can expect a detailed audit evaluating the 9 components of the continuing approval review and thorough communication from TEA staff utilizing synchronous digital platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Though TEA staff will not be visiting the EPP on site, the EPP can expect your assigned review program specialist to be readily available to communicate frequently and to meet with a variety of EPP staff throughout the review process. The assigned review program specialist will provide an agenda for the review so the EPP staff can plan their participation ahead of time. The virtual on-site review will follow the same format and expectations as an on-site review, but will be conducted virtually. Along with submitting the status report 2 weeks prior to the review date, a virtual on-site review will require the EPP to submit the appropriate candidate records and documents on or by the day of the review, similar to that of a desk review. In Appendix D of the handbook, you will find a document called Continuing Approval, Desk Review Documents and Record Submission Instructions 2020-2021. This document contains the list of records and other documentation that must be submitted to TEA for review. All of these records and documents must be received at TEA on or before the start date of your review identified in your notification letter. You will note that this document also provides guidance on how to label documents and files for submission. Please make sure file names are not long because long file names are difficult to download at TEA. One of the aspects of on-site reviews that TEA staff enjoys is getting to know your EPP staff because they are always so warm and welcoming. One of the aspects that we don't enjoy so much is that unfortunately we cannot accept your gracious gifts. Often we are offered commemorative items, lunches or dinners, etc., that we are not allowed to accept. This is not because we don't care. It is because our operating policies do not allow us to accept gifts. All of this is to say, please do not offer your TEA review team any meals or gifts. The only thing the review team will need is a room that locks, wireless access to the internet, and an EPP staff member on call to assist the review team. Also, if your site requires a parking pass for guests, EPP staff will need to work with TEA staff to secure the necessary documents and also identify the appropriate parking lot in which the team will park. At this point, I'm sure you're all wondering how we will know which candidate records will be reviewed. This information regarding candidates' records for review is relevant to all EPPs. So those receiving desk reviews, those receiving on-site reviews, and those receiving virtual on-site reviews. In your handbook, you will find some information about a document called the Designated Candidate List. Prior to your review, TEA will randomly select candidates from all of your programs and will request those records for review. At minimum, 5 candidates will be selected from each of your programs, or no less than 10 records for the EPP. Please note, larger programs with higher enrollment numbers may be required to provide a number of candidate records that is relative to the size of their program. The candidate names, TEA ID numbers, certificate area, and source will be provided on the designated candidate list. Candidate names will be selected from your finisher record list from the current reporting year and at least 1 or 2 years prior. The TEA review team may request additional records, such as records for 1 or more candidates identified on the status report. On-site review folks. This list will be handed to you on the opening morning of your on-site review. Virtual on-site review and desk review folks. This list will be sent to you 2 weeks prior to the start date of your review. In other words, on the day your review program specialist receives your completed status report, they will send you the designated candidate list. You will use the document submission instructions in Appendix D of your handbook to compile and label the documentation and records related to these candidates. All candidate records sent to TEA must be sent via secure file transfer. Notice in the screenshot on the right, the due date for the candidate records and the link to submit documents securely are at the top of the designated candidate list page. Again, I can't emphasize it enough how important it is to label files in such a way that communicates efficiently to the TEA review team what those files represent. When submitting candidate records and other requested EPP documents, use the file labeling guidance provided in the instructions in Appendix D of the handbook. In the example on this slide, the EPP is submitting some documentation relative to admission, so those file names will start with the designation C2. This means these files are for the admission component, which is in Component 2. Then, briefly identify the record. In this example, the EPP is submitting a list of candidates and their TEA ID numbers that were admitted to the EPP under the 10% exception rule. This allows your EPP to admit up to 10% of an incoming class with a GPA less than 2.50. So that document will be named C2_10% exception. In the second example, the EPP is submitting the admission records for one of the candidates on the designated candidate list. To do so, you would scan or download the records for that candidate and then save the document or file with the name C2_candidate name .TEA ID number. To keep the file name short, use the first initial only and then the full last name of the candidate. Both the name and TEA ID number must be included to ensure we have the records matched up for the appropriate candidate. Many candidates have similar names and/or TEA ID numbers. All documents and files submitted to TEA for review will use this label scheme. Please note for efficiency, if a record or piece of evidence does not exist, just drop a note on a placeholder document that says something like, "We could not locate this record," or "This candidate has not reached the point of clinical teaching yet, so there are no observations records for this candidate," or whatever is applicable, and send the note in place of the record requested. This information is necessary for all EPPs being reviewed. So it is very important that your documents are submitted to TEA through the appropriate submission process. This will primarily depend on whether your documents contain secure information or not. As a rule of thumb, any document containing information that can be linked to a candidate or an individual staff or faculty member in your program must be submitted via one of the two secure options above. The preferred method for transferring secure files for review is via the Share File service. We have placed an easy-to-use link on the designated candidate list document that can be used to submit files. The files you submit will land in a designated folder at TEA and not in a mailbox. TEA staff will review a notification email when your files have arrived. When you click on the link, it will prompt you to identify yourself, then attach the files. You might want to select the Remember Me option to avoid having to identify yourself each time you submit documents. The submitter will then receive an email confirmation of the upload. You might want to check your spam folder. The confirmation email will come from you to you. In the event you are unable to submit documents using the Share File service, please contact your review program specialist. The help desk is also an acceptable form for secure file submission. However, it should only be used to submit status report documents. All other non-secure documents may be submitted attached to a regular email. For all EPPs being reviewed, in both the desk review, on-site review, and virtual on-site review, documents and records are reviewed for evidence of alignment with requirements in TAP. Let's take a look at an example. When determining if the program has implemented a formal admission process, the review team would look for a letter to the applicant offering admission. To be compliant with the formal admission requirements, that letter would reflect the formal date of admission, and the applicant would have signed an acceptance of that offer. If this evidence was found in the candidate records, the program would be in compliance with the formal admission process in 19 TAC 227.17 through D. To ensure the entire formal admission process is in alignment with requirements in TAC, the reviewers would then consult the audit trail in each candidate's ECOS account to ensure that admission record was uploaded by EPP staff within 7 calendar days of the formal admission letter date embedded on the offer letter. If so, the requirement in 19 TAC 227.17E would be met. Finally, the review team would look at the date the candidate started coursework and training using dated evidence such as test dates, degree plans, transcripts depicting semester coursework, FBE logs, and certificate effective dates. If that actual start date was on or after the formal admission date embedded in the offer letter, then the program would be in compliance with 19 TAC 227.17F, which identifies the program may not begin providing coursework and training until after the candidate is formally admitted. Note here that one program within an EPP may have implemented the formal admission process, while another program may not. All programs within an EPP must have the formal admission process implemented for the EPP to be in compliance with the formal admission requirements. Another addition to this year's review process involves programs with a principal as instructional leader program, also known as a PIL program. EPPs being reviewed this year may be asked to participate in a PIL follow-up. The purpose of this follow-up is to check in with programs to see how their PIL programs are doing. EPPs can expect this follow-up to be conducted as a focus group, where the EPPs are encouraged to share data, information, and discuss progress directly related to their PIL program. It is important to note this PIL follow-up will not be evaluated as part of the 2020-2021 continuing approval review, but it will occur concurrently. EPPs can expect TEA to reach out to you before or during your review with additional information, data, and opportunities to engage in reflection. Before we move on to part 3, we're going to pass the mic again to Lori to help us answer a few more questions. Please let us hear the questions from the programs being reviewed this year first. And if we do not get to all the questions today, we will follow up with the responses to all of your questions in an FAQ after the webinar.
Okay, this is Lori. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you, Lori.
Awesome. All right, so we've had a few questions. I've had a few come in about locating the posted documents. I just want to reiterate that you can find the documents that we've posted, such as the rubric, on the Program Provider Resources page on the TEA website. If you scroll all the way to the bottom in the Forms and Documents section, you should find the rubric there. Likewise, there was a question, is there or will there be an evidence chart posted to the Program Provider Resources page? Well, not exactly. There is the figure that's embedded in 228 in TAC. That is the evidence figure, and then the posted rubric reflects the evidence that's in that figure. The rubric is more updated than the figure. So you want to use the rubric that's posted on the program provider page if you're going to be conducting any sort of a self-assessment prior to your review. Another question says, if the EPP sends TEA the status report before the 2 weeks prior to the review, will TEA still send out the designated candidates list that same day? The answer is that the designated candidate list will go out 2 weeks prior to the review for every program, regardless how early you send your status report in. Remember, we hold all programs to the same accountability and same requirements. So everyone is given that 2 weeks in which to prepare and submit their candidate records. Okay, so Emily, in the interest of saving time, I'll go back to you, let you progress on through the webinar, and then we'll continue to answer questions as we get closer to the end.
Awesome, thanks, Lori. This next section will cover the details. We'll cover the details about what happens after the documentation and records have been reviewed. This is another slide that you will all want to tune into, both through desk review, on-site review, and virtual on-site review, folks. There are several reasons why TEA customarily involves a variety of EPP staff throughout the review process. We've previously addressed some of them, such as visiting with program faculty on-site. Let's talk about the desk review process first. After the initial review is complete, the assigned review program specialist will hold a conference call with EPP staff to debrief the initial findings. At that point, the program specialist will invite EPP staff to submit additional documentation if necessary. After that, the review will be formally closed and EPP staff will have the opportunity to review the final report. For the on-site review and virtual on-site review, the TEA review team will hold a daily debrief with EPP staff at the end of each day to discuss findings and identify additional documentation needed for the next day. At the closing review on the final day, TEA staff and EPP staff will discuss findings and collaboratively develop a compliance plan to guide corrective actions if necessary. The compliance plan will remain with the EPP, and a formal report will be sent later for the EPP to review. At all points during the review process, EPPs are encouraged to include a variety of staff members so that staff from all programs within the EPP have an opportunity to celebrate the wins and collaborate on the opportunities for improvement. During the closing session with EPP staff, the TEA program specialist assigned to your review will debrief the findings. At that point, any areas that were identified as out of compliance with TAC will be discussed. For desk reviews, when the report is issued, the section entitled Next Steps will itemize these areas and identify the date by which all areas must be brought into compliance. That timeline will be 4 months from the close of the desk review. If you're receiving an on-site review or a virtual on-site review, the TEA review team and EPP staff present at the closing meeting will discuss results and collaboratively develop a plan to bring the out-of-compliance areas back into compliance. An example of the compliance plan form is depicted on this slide. For the most part, you will also have a 4-month window in which to correct all areas, but there may be areas such as curriculum that could require a longer timeline to bring into compliance. These dates will be determined with the EPP staff. EPPs that are under SBEC orders will not receive a compliance plan. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Let's look at what happens after the review is complete. 19 TAC 229.6 requires specific action on the part of TEA staff and the SBEC depending on the outcome of the review. If the review reveals that your programs meet or exceed requirements in TAC, then TEA staff will recommend to the SBEC to approve the renewal of your EPP. It is important to note here that all programs within the EPP are reviewed and contribute to the success of the EPP. Once the SBEC approves the continuation or renewal of the EPP will be placed in the 5-year rotation, and the EPP will be reviewed again in 5 years, unless problems come up in the interim that warrant a discretionary review. As discussed earlier, if any of the programs within your EPP are found to be non-compliant with TAC, your EPP will be provided a set of next steps that will be focused on bringing the program back into alignment with TAC. For those receiving an on-site or virtual on-site review, TA staff and EPP staff will collaboratively create a compliance plan for improvement at the closing meeting. The next steps and compliance plans are time-bound and evidence-based and focus on improvement of the EPP based on the unique requirements of that EPP. If the EPP corrects all areas identified in the next steps or the compliance plan within the agreed-upon timeline, TEA staff will issue a recommendation that SBEC approve the renewal of the EPP. If the EPP fails to correct any areas identified in the next steps or the compliance plan by the agreed-upon timeline, TEA staff will recommend the SBEC sanction the EPP. Note that TAC identifies that sanctions may include public reprimand, conditions on continued approval, or revocation, but there could be other sanctions as well. The sanctions will likely depend on the nature of the violations of TAC. We have come to the end of our training today. The key messages from today are the following. 1, TEA is required to review EPPs. 2, EPPs are expected to maintain appropriate records and provide them as evidence during the review. 3, EPPs must send all required documentation and records by the date specified on the notification letter. 4, candidate records must be submitted securely. 5, there are a lot of available resources to help you with this process. Contact your assigned review program specialist if necessary. And 6, corrective action is required and time-bound. It looks like we have some time for a few more questions before we close the call. So we'll call on Lori one more time to help us answer a few more questions.
Okay, looking through some of the remaining questions. I'm not really sure what this question is about, but I'm going to answer it the way what I think is being asked. It says you have a principal as instructional leader explanation. What about the reading specialist programs? So if you have an approved program that is active, it will be reviewed. So the PIL activity, focus group type activity, is an extra thing in addition to what's going on with the review. because PIL is a new. All programs will be reviewed. We will pull records from your principal program, from your reading specialist program, from your school counselor program, from all programs that are active in your EPP. And so then an additional question is, if we closed our teacher and principal programs, will we just be asked to submit records from our superintendent candidates? Yes, we are going to be reviewing the programs that you offer. And if you have programs that you no longer offer that are closed, your review specialist will probably initiate a conversation with you about removing that program from your inventory if that is necessary. Now, let me see if there are other questions here. Let's see. Oh, can you clarify how we send a note for a file not found or a document not found? So, yes. So when you're, for example, sending admission records for a candidate, let's say if your principal program had not implemented the formal admission process, so there are no letters, offer letters of admission to your principal candidates. We'll figure that out eventually, but it sure saves us time if you'll just write or type on a piece of paper, no formal admission letters are found for this candidate, and then scan that in with the candidate's other admission records and send it, then we will not spend a lot of time looking for records that don't exist. Let's see. A lot of questions about candidate lists and when they will be received, but I think we covered that. I don't really see any more questions. I'm scanning through them. I could have missed one or two, but for the most part, I think we've addressed everything. Some of the earlier questions were answered later on in the webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, Emily, I think that's going to be it. We will look at the questions more closely, obviously, after we close the webinar. And if we miss any, we will be sure and get those posted. Or if they are specific to your program, we will reach out to you individually and address that with you. Emily, back to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lori. So this concludes our training for today. On behalf of the Educator Preparation Program staff at TEA, I want to thank you for attending. I hope we've been able to answer most, if not all, of your questions about the review process. We will post an FAQ with answers to all the questions being asked today, along with today's slide deck in script and on the program provider resources page on the TEA website. You are encouraged to contact your program specialist assigned to your review if you have any additional questions about your review. Have a great day, and thanks for tuning in.